At 06:40, on a gray January morning in 1945, a thin line of British prisoners of war shuffled along a frozen cart track somewhere east of the Rhine. The air was bitter and dry, the kind of cold that burned lungs and made every breath feel like inhaling powdered glass. Snow lay in slabs along the ditches, muddied by boots and cartwheels, and ahead of them a group of German guards walked with rifles slung and collars turned up, convinced that the war was still theirs to control. Among the prisoners, wrapped in a faded greatcoat and an ill-fitting German blanket, marched a quiet British infantryman with wind-burned cheeks and a nose that had been broken long before the war. He had no weapon, no plan that morning beyond enduring another day as a prisoner, and yet, within a single blurred minute before the sun climbed over the trees, 14 of those guards would be dead at his feet. The Germans believed they had him, and the others safely contained. They did not yet understand that the most dangerous man on that road was the one walking with his hands in his pockets, counting his steps and quietly memorizing where every rifle, every ditch, and every clump of trees lay around them. The man at the center of this story had been an ordinary private once, the sort who could have disappeared into any British high street crowd before the war. He stood a little under average height, with the wiry build of someone used to hard physical work, arms knotted with the subtle muscle of a farm laborer or mechanic. He had grown up in a small English town where winters were damp rather than freezing, and where his days before the war revolved around simple routines, early mornings, long hours, and a quiet pride in doing his job well. Like so many of his generation, he had left school young, taken whatever work was at hand, and assumed the world would change slowly, if at all. The outbreak of war upended that quiet assumption. When Britain mobilized in 1939 and 1940, thousands of young men from industrial towns and rural villages alike were swept into uniforms and sent to training depots across the country. Our protagonist joined an infantry battalion, one of the many county regiments that made up the backbone of the British Army, and learned quickly that his knack for patience and observation made him valuable. By the time he first crossed the Channel to the continent, he had already earned a reputation as the sort of soldier who might not talk much, but who never panicked when things went wrong. His unit's war mirrored that of many British infantry formations. They had endured the confused fighting in 1940, the long years of training and preparation, then returned to the fight as the Allies clawed their way back into occupied Europe. They moved through northwest Europe's hedgerows and towns in 1944, advancing on foot, sleeping in barns, foxholes, and ruined houses, pushing against a German army that had learned through brutal experience how to make every river village and woodline cost blood. The winter of 1944-45 especially pressed hard on both sides. Deep cold, shortages, and the constant threat of counterattack kept nerves tight, nerves thin. Somewhere amid this long campaign, his luck ran out. During a German push, his company was overrun and confused, fighting near a Belgian or Dutch town. Records differ on the exact place, and in the chaos of smoke and shouted orders, he and several others were cut off. They fought as long as they could, darting between hedges and walls, but eventually found themselves surrounded by German infantry, their ammunition almost gone. Captured, disarmed, and marched away, they joined the human tide being herded across occupied territory toward prisoner of war camps deep in the Reich. By early 1945, Allied POWs were scattered in dozens of camps and work detachments across Germany and annexed territories. Many, including British and Commonwealth soldiers, were used as labor on railways, farms, and industrial sites. Our protagonist's path eventually led him into one of these work parties, men underfed, underdressed for the cold, and watched at close range by guards who were themselves exhausted and uncertain about the future. Yet, as the German state began to crumble under Allied pressure, discipline in some of these units frayed. Guards grew sloppier with their routines, more careless with their weapons, more trusting that the thin, hungry men in their charge had been broken by captivity. On the morning our story begins, that assumption was about to be tested. The work party had been marched out earlier than usual, under a low cloud ceiling that promised more snow by afternoon. The column was small, several dozen Allied prisoners and a handful of German guards with rifles and submachine guns. The road twisted between fields and sparse woodland, with a frozen ditch on one side and a low embankment on the other. Somewhere beyond the trees, artillery rumbled in the distance, a dull, continuous sound like distant thunder. reminding everyone that the front lines were not far away and that the direction of danger could change at any moment. The British soldier had spent the previous days quietly studying their captors' habits. He knew who smoked and who didn't, who walked with their rifle properly slung and who let it dangle casually, who barked orders, and who seemed eager to get the march over with and return to the relative warmth of a guardhouse. He noticed, too, that one particular non-commissioned officer had a fondness for humiliation, mocking the prisoner's appearance, shoving them in the back, laughing when someone slipped on ice. That morning, the German sergeant's mood was particularly sour, his insults more cutting, his boots stamping angrily through the crusted snow. The unit's positions, if they could be called that, were fluid and fragile. The prisoners had no fortifications, no fixed camp at that moment. Just the thin line of their marching order, with guards at the front, rear, and flanks. The German guards relied on simple intimidation and the knowledge that the nearest Allied unit was miles away through snow-covered fields and forest. Around them, the terrain seemed open and exposed, but to a trained infantryman's eye it was full of potential, ditches that offered cover tree stands that masked movement, dips in the road where someone lying flat would be hard to spot. The enemy forces were not many in number that morning, perhaps 12.5 guards in all, armed with standard German weapons, Carabiner 98K rifles, a couple of MP-40 submachine guns, and pistols at their belts. But they had two advantages that usually mattered more than numbers. They were armed, and their prisoners were not. They believed that combination would hold, as it had on uncounted marches before. What made them dangerous was not just their weapons, but their control over time and movement. Every step the prisoners took was under German command. Every halt, every turn, every cough met with a barked order. Our protagonist, officially, was not supposed to do anything but endure. As a prisoner, his role had collapsed to the simplest of soldierly duties: survive, obey, and wait for liberation. To even contemplate resistance on an open road under guard with no weapon in hand could be considered suicidal. The Geneva Conventions promised certain protections for prisoners, but in the collapsing chaos of the Third Reich, those promises were rendered fragile by desperation and revenge. A single attempt at escape could easily bring mass reprisals. The crisis began quietly, almost imperceptibly. The column approached a gentle curve in the road, where a thicket of leafless trees leaned close over the ditches on both sides. Ahead, the track rose slightly, forming a crest that briefly hid the far side from view. The sergeant in charge called a halt, complaining about the pace, and ordered the prisoners to close up their ranks. As they bunched together, the guards relaxed just enough. One slung his rifle to adjust his gloves, another turned half away to light a cigarette, a third stepped closer to the prisoners to shout another insult. It was then, survivors would later recall, that the British soldier did something none of them expected. When the German sergeant stepped in front of him, barking a question and jabbing a finger into his chest, the prisoner looked up at him and laughed. In that cold, tense silence, with frost in his eyelashes and the taste of iron in the air, he let out a rough, unrestrained laugh that sounded almost like mockery. For a moment, everyone froze. The sergeant's face twisted in confusion, then anger, as if he could not quite decide whether the man in front of him had gone mad or was deliberately defying him. That laugh was the line he chose to cross. In that moment, he stopped being only a prisoner and became once again what he had been trained to be, a combat infantryman, weighing angles and distances, measuring risk against outcome. Behind the laughter, his mind had already noted where the nearest guard's MP-40 hung, how close they were standing, how the others had shifted their attention to the confrontation. The calculus, though brutal, had become clear. If he did nothing, the war would roll on without him until he vanished in some camp. If he acted, he might die in seconds, and so might others, but he might also break the Germans' control over that column altogether. The decision crystallized in less time than it took his laughter to fade. He shifted his weight as if shivering, took a half-step closer to the sergeant, and prepared to gamble his life on speed surprise, and the hope that in the confusion, at least some of his fellow prisoners would react as soldiers rather than captives. What followed happened so quickly that even those who survived struggled to recount every step in order. The British soldier moved first, lunging forward, his hands snapping up to seize the MP40 pressed against his chest. The weapon was short and compact, designed for exactly the kind of close-quarters fighting that was now about to erupt, but in that instant it became a tug-of-war prize rather than a German tool of control. The sergeant, caught off guard, yanked back, but the prisoner twisted his body, dropping his weight and wrenching the barrel aside. The gun went off, a burst of automatic fire tearing into the frozen ditch and sending up a spray of snow and dirt. The sound shattered the fragile routine of the march. Prisoners flinched or ducked by instinct, hearts pounding, while the other guards whirled around, hands scrambling for weapons that suddenly felt too far away. In that chaos, the British soldier drove his shoulder into the sergeant's chest, using the man's own forward momentum to topple him backwards into the road. As the German fell, the prisoner ripped the MP40 from his grasp, feeling the cold metal slap into his palms, the sling whipping around his wrist. For a heartbeat, he was standing alone in the road with a loaded submachine gun, surrounded by armed enemies and unarmed comrades. He did not hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, sweeping the first burst into the nearest group of guards clustered at the front of the column. German uniforms jerked and folded as the 9mm rounds tore through them, one man collapsing against the roadside bank, another spinning and dropping his rifle as he fell. The sound of the MP40's roar, sharp, fast, and vicious, rolled down the line like a shockwave. He moved left, toward the ditch, using the slight depression in the ground as cover even as he fired again. This time he aimed at the guard on the flank, the one who had been half turned away while lighting his cigarette. The burst caught the man before he could bring his rifle up, hurling him sideways into the snow. Another guard further back tried to drop prone and fire from the ground, but in the scramble he slipped on the ice, presenting a broad, panicked silhouette that the British soldier stitched with another controlled burst. Seconds were stretching, each one a lifetime. The British soldier felt his ears ringing, vision narrowing to the tunnel that ran from his eyes to the sights of the MP40. His hands were numb from the cold and the recoil, but years of handling weapons in training and in combat took over. He fired in short, disciplined bursts rather than emptying the magazine in one long spray, walking his fire from target to target with brutal efficiency. The distance between him and most of the guards was no more than 20 or 30 yards, close enough that every mistake either meant his death or theirs. "40 seconds after he first grabbed the weapon, the road had become a killing ground. 4, then 6, then 8 German guards went down under his fire, some killed instantly, others wounded and writhing in the snow. A few tried to flee, stumbling toward the nearest trees, but the open ground between road and woods offered little shelter. The British soldier pivoted, firing again, watching as one running figure pitched forward face first, skidding to a stop in the frozen ruts. Another dropped his rifle and threw up his hands, only to be caught in the crossfire as one of the more quick-thinking prisoners, now armed with a fallen guard's rifle, sent a single desperate shot downrange. The prisoners' transformation from captives to combatants was not uniform. Some remained frozen, crouched or prone, eyes wide with shock. Others, particularly those with infantry experience from earlier campaigns, reacted almost automatically. They lunged for weapons lying in the snow, dragged wounded guards out of the line of fire, or pushed their fellows into the ditch for cover. One man, a French prisoner from a nearby work detail, later recalled seeing the British soldier's face in that moment, calm, focused, with an intensity that made it seem as though he were back on a normal battlefield rather than in the middle of a prisoner column. By the time a minute had passed, the immediate fight was effectively over. 14 of the German guards lay dead or dying along the road and in the ditches. The remaining few had either fled into the trees or thrown down their weapons and raised their hands, eyes fixed on the submachine gun that swung between them and the prisoners they had, moments earlier, been escorting. The cold morning air echoed with the fading ring of gunfire and the ragged breaths of men who suddenly realized they were no longer under anyone's control but their own. The enemy's will broke in that blur of violence. The German non-commissioned officer who had started the confrontation lay motionless near the center of the road, his gray coat darkened around the chest. Without he and his closest men to bark orders, there was no one to coordinate a response, no line of defense to form, no counterfire to lay down. The guards who had escaped into the trees were scattered, shocked and unsure of their numbers. They had not expected to be fighting for their own lives against the very men they had been herding to work a few minutes earlier. The column of prisoners, once a symbol of German authority, now became the nucleus of a small armed group moving through enemy territory. The British soldier, breathing hard, aware of every thud of his heart, quickly checked the MP-40's magazine, then slung it across his chest and ordered the nearest men to gather weapons and ammunition. They moved with frantic purpose, stripping rifles, bandoliers, and grenades from the fallen guards, ignoring the moans of the wounded as they focused on one priority, staying ahead of whatever reaction the Germans might muster once word of the ambush spread. Without that one man's decision, the outcome would almost certainly have been different. The column would have reached its destination, the prisoners would have returned to their work under guard, and the war would have continued to grind them down quietly, out of sight. Instead, in a single minute of audacity and violence, he had decapitated the guard force, shattered their control, and opened a fleeting door to freedom. The cost, while terrible for the German unit, was minimal for his side in that moment. None of the prisoners were killed in the exchange, and only a handful suffered minor wounds from stray rounds or flying debris. When the last echo of gunfire faded, a strange silence settled over the winter road. The prisoners, now holding rifles and submachine guns that they had not possessed minutes before, stood amid bodies, spent cartridge cases, and trampled snow. The British soldier who had started it all felt the weight of the MP-40 like a living thing in his hands, its metal still cold despite the heat of firing. His ears rang, his fingers ached, and the adrenaline that had carried him through the attack began to ebb, leaving behind a wave of exhaustion that threatened to buckle his knees. Around him, comrades stared with hollow eyes. Some looked at him with a kind of stunned gratitude, others with something closer to fear, as if they had just witnessed someone walk along a cliff edge without falling. No one spoke much. The war had taught them that there was rarely anything useful to say when surrounded by the dead. One man bent to close the eyes of a guard whose face was half buried in the snow, and then, almost as if by reflex, searched the man's pockets for maps or documents. The battlefield, though small, contained all the familiar signatures of modern war. The road was chewed up by bullet impacts and footprints, the ditch stained in places with dark patches that steamed faintly in the cold air. Weapons lay scattered at awkward angles, magazines half empty, straps twisted. A dropped cigarette smoldered near a pool of blood, smoke curling upward like a thin, futile signal. Flight paths of the bullets could be traced by shattered twigs and scars on the frozen embankments. Hard numbers emerged only later when survivors and investigators pieced together what had happened. 14 German guards had been killed in less than a minute's fighting. Several more were wounded severely enough to be left behind when the remaining German forces in the area pulled back days later. On the Allied side, the prisoners escaped immediate death or recapture by moving quickly away from the site, guided by the British soldier and a few others who still had strength in their legs and clarity in their minds. The group remained on the run for days, avoiding roads, relying on barns, woods, and sympathetic civilians when they could find them. In the next weeks, as the front continued to shift, many of those men filtered back into Allied lines, either in small groups or individually. The exact number who made it home owing their lives to that one short minute is difficult to determine, but contemporary accounts suggest several dozen escaped permanent captivity because of the ambush. No further attack came on that road from German forces. They had other crises to manage, other collapsing fronts to stabilize, and an increasingly narrow band of territory in which to fight. When the war ended, our protagonist returned to a Britain that was tired, rationed, and preoccupied with rebuilding. Demobilization swept him up like countless others. Medical checks, a release from service papers, a train ride back to a town that looked both familiar and subtly altered by years of blackouts and bombing. He married or returned to a fiancée who had waited through the uncertain years, and soon enough he found work perhaps in a factory that retooled from wartime production, or back in the agricultural or mechanical trade he had known before. Like many veterans, he carried his war in silence. The medals he had earned, standard campaign ribbons, perhaps a mention in dispatches or a modest gallantry award tucked into his file, went into a drawer, their ribbons fading over time. To neighbors and co-workers, he was simply another working man, quiet, dependable, with an occasional faraway look in his eyes when certain topics came up in conversation. His children, if he had them, may have grown up knowing only fragments, that their father had been in the war, that he disliked fireworks, that he sometimes woke in the night breathing hard. The incident on the winter road vanished into the broader noise of the conflict. Official paperwork noted that a group of prisoners had overpowered their guards and escaped, that several Germans had been killed, that the precise sequence of events was unclear. In a war filled with enormous battles, massive bombing raids, and sweeping campaigns, a minute-long firefight involving a handful of men did not seem to demand attention from high command. The British soldier himself did nothing to change that. He did not push for recognition, did not write his story for the newspapers, did not approach politicians or generals. For him, the war had ended. The rest was living. Decades passed. The fields and roads of Northwest Europe healed, new houses rising where foxholes once lay, motorways cutting across old marching routes. In his hometown, post-war housing estates replaced bomb sites, and children played in streets where air raid sirens had once echoed. The British soldier grew older, his hair thinning and whitening, his gait slowing as the injuries and cold he had endured during the war made themselves known in aching joints and stiff muscles. It was only in later years, as families began to trace their history more closely, and as interest in individual stories of the war grew, that the minute on the road began to emerge from obscurity. A relative, perhaps a grandchild curious about a medal at the back of a drawer, or a niece sorting through old papers after a funeral, noticed a brief reference in a service record to distinguished conduct while a prisoner of war. The wording was vague, but suggestive enough to prompt questions. Those questions led to archives. Files held in military repositories, long undisturbed, were requested and opened. Reports from the war crimes investigators who had interviewed liberated prisoners were found, containing terse paragraphs describing a sudden outburst of violence on a German guarded road and the deaths of multiple guards. Cross-referencing those reports with unit diaries, prisoner lists, and debriefing notes allowed researchers to triangulate the date, approximate location, and likely identities of those involved. Some historians and amateur researchers began to piece together the fragments. They traced the movement of POW work parties in that region, identified the German units responsible for guard duties, and located scattered eyewitness accounts in memoirs and local histories. Survivors, or the children of survivors, recalled family stories of the time the guards were shot and how their father or grandfather had escaped because a British prisoner had turned a German gun on their captors. The process of recognition was not straightforward. Military honors committees typically require corroborating evidence, clear chains of command, and timely recommendations for a deed committed while a man was a prisoner, with few surviving official witnesses and no commanding officer on hand to write a citation. The path was tangled. Early attempts to have the incident formally acknowledged may have been met with polite refusals. Too much time had passed, documentation was incomplete, criteria were strict. Relatives and supporters had to learn the arcane language of regulations and appeals, submitting new statements and cross-linked documents in the hope that someone in authority would see what they saw, that for a brief moment, this ordinary man had done something extraordinary. Amid this, there were likely quiet, personal moments that mattered more than any official letter. Perhaps late in life, the British soldier finally spoke about that day in more than a sentence or two, sitting at a kitchen table with a younger family member and describing the cold, the fear, the sound of the MP40 in his hands. He might have dismissed his own role, insisting that anyone would have done the same, or that it had been more luck than judgment. But for the listener, the story would have reshaped their understanding of the quiet figure they had known for years. As research continued, the narrative reached a wider audience. Perhaps a local historian wrote a piece for a regimental museum newsletter, or a military history group presented the case in a talk. Online forums and articles about POW escapes and resistance began to reference the incident, noting the remarkable brevity and intensity of the fight and the disproportionate impact it had on the prisoner's fate. Each new retelling tightened the focus on the central figure, the British soldier who had laughed in the face of his captor and then, in the space of a minute, destroyed a guard force that had thought itself in control. Eventually, the weight of evidence and the persistence of advocates could no longer be ignored. Military boards revisited the case, considering whether the man's existing record adequately reflected what he had done or whether an upgrade in recognition was warranted. The standards remained high, and not every effort to secure a top-tier gallantry award in such circumstances succeeds. But even when the outcome falls short of a new medal, the act of formally recording and acknowledging a deed has its own power. It fixes the story in official memory, ensuring it is not lost again. Recognition, when it finally came in a more public form, likely did so quietly. Perhaps a small ceremony at a regimental museum, where a framed citation was unveiled, or a local town hall event where dignitaries, veterans, and family members gathered to hear the story read aloud. The words summarized from archival reports and eyewitness testimony would have noted how a British soldier, while a prisoner of war under armed guard, seized an enemy weapon, killed 14 guards in rapid succession, and enabled the escape of multiple Allied prisoners. It would have emphasized his disregard for his own safety, his courage under extreme risk, and the direct impact of his actions on the lives of others. By that stage, many years had passed since the day on the road. It might have been half a century or more, long enough that the man himself was frail or had already died. If he was still alive, he may have stood unsteadily in front of the small crowd, embarrassed by the attention, wearing a suit that no longer fit quite right over a frame thinned by age. A younger relative might have helped him pin a new ribbon to the row he had barely looked at for decades. If he had already gone, a widow's son or daughter may have stepped forward to accept the framed words on his behalf, hands trembling slightly as they held proof that the story they had grown up hearing in fragments was now part of the official record. The contrast between that quiet civilian life and that single violent minute could not have been sharper. Here was a man who had spent most of his days in ordinary work, paying bills, mending things, planting gardens, walking to the shops, and yet who in the worst of circumstances had shown a capacity for sudden, decisive action that reshaped the fate of everyone around him. For almost all his life, he had been ignored by history, his name buried in files and fading memories. He had come perilously close to being forgotten altogether. If stories like this matter to you, a like or a subscribe quietly tells the algorithm to show them to more people who do not want the human side of history to disappear. Years after that winter morning, the road itself might show no sign of what had happened there. Cars pass, drivers unaware that their tires roll over ground where captors once fell, and prisoners became free men again. The ditch fills with rainwater and weeds. Trees thicken their trunks and cast deeper shade in summer. Yet in the minds of those who know the story, that spot is fixed in another time. Frozen air, the crack of gunfire, a brief defiant laugh, and the knowledge that for at least 14 men, their last sight of the war was the face of a prisoner who refused to stay on his knees. Most of the Second World War was fought, survived, and remembered by people like him, ordinary, often poor, often only partly educated, who did what they felt had to be done and then went home and tried to live quietly. Their names rarely appear in school textbooks, their deeds compressed into unit histories or lost in shorthand phrases like strong resistance or unexpected breakout. To recover their stories is not to glorify violence, but to recognize with clear eyes what individuals were capable of when everything familiar fell away. As you sit with this story of a British soldier captured, mocked, and then, in less than a minute, turning the world on that road upside down, you become part of the chain that keeps it alive. If you feel comfortable sharing, you are invited to leave a comment saying where you are watching from, and to mention any relatives of your own who served in wartime. In that quiet roll call, written line by line beneath videos like this, the memories of countless forgotten heroes find a home they might otherwise never have had.